Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering my pick for the best Bladesinging Wizard build in Baldur's Gate 3. This class, newly added in patch 8, brings all of the awesome spellcasting power of a wizard, and adds to that the martial prowess of a melee fighter. If you want to dance around the battlefield, casting earth-shaking enchantments, and exchanging mighty blows with your fearsome foes, then this is the character for you. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to T. Browns for the $10 donation, Wanda Husbando for the £10, and Dr. Froggenstein, Altered Ego, and Potato Aureus for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. It really means a whole lot to me. Alright, let's do some blade singing. I'm using Gale here as the example character because of course this is a wizard build and he's the wizard of the party, but if you're building this as a custom character, then for races I would suggest Halfling. The already awesome power of Halfling's ability to reroll ones is multiplied for this character because we will both be making a lot of weapon attacks, which means rolling a lot of dice, and concentrating on spells. We'll also probably be making more concentration checks than a normal wizard will be because our positioning in the front lines will cause us to take a little bit more damage on average than your typical cowardly wizard who hides in the back. So Halfling is excellent for Bladesinging Wizard. Other great picks include Wood Elf or Half Wood Elf for the bonus movement speed, or Githyanki for the once per day Misty Step, which again, because of our being a melee-focused wizard, and wizards do not get a lot of hit points, Misty Step in an emergency is even more valuable for this character than it already is for pretty much every other character in the game. There's also darkness-focused versions of this build, depending on what items you have equipped, which I will talk about a little more in the gear section. But if you are going to be a darkness-focused version of the Bladesinging Wizard, then Drow or Half-Drow or Asmodeus Tiefling to get the extra casts of darkness can be very helpful for this build as well, because more casts of darkness is great if you're planning to do shenanigans with darkness. So those are the picks that I would suggest. For this guide, we'll be focusing on a monoclass Bladesinging Wizard, but I should mention that Bladesinging Wizard multiclasses extremely well with a number of different options, and several of them you would want to take at first level if you're doing so. For example, if you're taking levels in Fighter or Sorcerer, you'd want to take at least one of those as your first level, because they give you Constitution save proficiency, which is extremely useful for a character that wants to maintain concentration on spells. So if you're multiclassing with Bladesinging Wizard, you're probably going to start that character with one of those classes instead. However, for this guide, we're focusing on a monoclass character, so we're going to start with a level of Wizard. For our cantrip selection, we are going to be taking a ranged cantrip in the form of Ray of Frost. This is generally the best combat cantrip in the game, other than possibly Eldritch Blast. You could double the damage, it slows enemy with wet condition, it slows enemy movement speed, it's got 60-foot range, just an extremely powerful utility spell and damaging spell. And then we'll also be taking the free melee damage from Booming Blade, which can be used on every attack that we make in order to deal an extra d8 of thunder damage when enemies move, and then scale to deal initial damage, and then even more damage when they move at levels 5 and 10 when your cantrips upgrade. I have seen some people suggest that you shouldn't take Booming Blade at level 1 and instead wait until level 4 because it doesn't get the initial damage until level 5. I believe that is incorrect. This is free damage that you can use on every attack. The best price for something is free, so taking Booming Blade at early levels is often going to add a ton of extra damage to your character, so always grab this one at level 1 and use it as often as it can possibly be used. Minor Illusion is still an extremely powerful cantrip, so we're going to grab that here, and especially useful for a wizard because grouping up enemies for AoE damage before a fight starts is very useful. We will also be able to deal AoE damage with our Bladesong Climax ability, so Minor Illusion is especially good for this character to pull enemies into a group for AoE spells, or get them to split up so we can take them out one by one. For our spell selection, of course we're a wizard, so we're going to learn all of these level 1 spells from scrolls eventually when we find them, but we want the most powerful spell selection available at level 1. And Bladesinging Wizard does have to emphasize slightly different things than most other wizard builds. Obviously, every wizard is going to take shield regardless, but this is an especially critical tool for Bladesinging Wizard. We're going to be up in the mix, so we want to be able to block enemy attacks so that we don't die even at level 1, we're going to have very few hit points, and that's just going to get worse over the course of the game because we're a wizard, so we're not gaining that many hit points over the course of the game. Shield can help keep us alive alongside the extra armor class that we get from our Bladesong. In addition to that, this allows us to build up multiple charges for our Bladesong climax, which I'll talk about when we get to Bladesing Wizard at level 2. But because this is a reaction, it's an extremely important tool for building up extra damage with what the class is trying to do. Next, of course, we definitely want Longstrider, because Longstrider is incredibly powerful for every party. Every character should use this. So unless you're having a camp caster always cast this, which is definitely an option, you need this on one of your party members to make absolutely certain your characters move faster. Again, mobility is even more important for this wizard than every other wizard. On a similar note, Enhanced Leap is very important. The distance that we can move to activate Bladesong Climax is our jump distance, so increasing our jump distance gives us a lot more mobility and flexibility with that spell, and also, of course, gives us a lot more mobility in combat in general. Finally, Magic Missile is the best early game combat spell. It's extremely reliable, and Chromatic Orb will give us a ton of additional combat options at early levels. And then we're going to round things out with Grease, which lets us knock enemies prone and has a ton of extra control in a large AoE. For our ability score selection, there's actually a lot of different ways that we can set up this character in the late game, depending on what we want to emphasize for our ability scores, but they all start with the same setup in the early game. We're going to be taking 16 in Dexterity, 14 in Constitution, 16 in Intelligence, and 12 in Wisdom. This character is going to attack with its weapons using finesse weapons, so we need high dexterity in order to actually hit and do damage with our weapon attacks. And of course, we're a wizard, so we still want to max out our intelligence. However, there's a couple caveats to this that can change how we're going to manage our ability scores later in the game. Later, when we get the Gloves of Dexterity, we could drop our Dexterity to 8 and just use the gloves instead in order to free up these ability points to go into Constitution and Wisdom. We could also, if we don't want to cast offensive spells and instead play this as more of a melee character using supporting spells, use the Headband of Intellect to replace having to take Intelligence. So we could drop either of these two scores and replace them with an attribute item. Another option is to, instead of attacking with Dexterity, use an Elixir of Giant Strength and just attack with our Strength, even if we're using a finesse weapon, which also has the side benefit of increasing our jump distance, carry weight, and so on, and doesn't require us to waste an item slot on that, though of course the Elixir slot is also very, very valuable. Any of those could be great options, or we can just build the character naturally. I will show you the way to build it naturally, but I'll talk about all of the possible late game attribute splits when we get to the item section. Finally, for skill selection, there's really nothing important here. This character is going to be based on intelligence and dexterity, so won't be doing too much conversation. If you can get sleight of hand from background, then it is a dexterity-based character, so you can have it do your lockpicking, but the Bladesinging Wizard is not going to have skill bonuses to lockpicking the way a rogue or bard might, so you're probably still better off having another character handle that, but it's an option if your party really needs a sleight of hand user and doesn't have another character that can do it conveniently. Alright, that's all the decisions we have to make at level 1. Let's move on to level 2. At character level 2, we're leveling up, and we get to take our subclass, which of course is going to be the Bladesinging Wizard. Instead of specializing in a school of magic, we specialize in sword, and get access to skills that involve sword. For our spell selection here, of course this is going to be somewhat dependent on what scrolls you found, but some more good early game options include Sleep and Fog Cloud. Find Familiar is also very useful, and Thunderwave can be very, very helpful for this character. If you get into a tight spot, you can push enemies away and then maybe run away without provoking an attack of opportunity. All great options there. We also get to choose a Bladesinger's weapon here, and this button does not matter. All this does is conjure a non-magical version of one of these weapons into your inventory. It looks like it's going to be an important choice, but it's not, so just pick whatever. I think the rapier gives you the most gold when you sell it, so I guess that's what I would pick. Don't quote me on that, though, because I haven't looked it up. But that button mostly doesn't matter. It's just there to confuse you. In addition to that, when we select Bladesinging Wizard, we get a number of bonuses. Firstly, we get Bladesong Power, which is the resource that we use to activate our Bladesong. We have 2 at this level. Obviously, it's not in the tooltip anywhere how many of these we get. But similar to a Barbarian's Rage, we only get 2 at early levels, which means unless you're long resting very, very frequently, you'll probably want to be a little conservative with your use of Bladesong and only use it in more difficult fights. We also get proficiency in light armor, the performance skill, and proficiency with a bunch of sword-type weapons. Obviously very important if we're going to be using a sword to have proficiency with those swords. And while light armor proficiency isn't a significant upgrade most of the time, it's still moderately useful some of the time. A lot of frequently, though, you're still going to be using a robe and mage armor rather than light armor, because it will often end up being higher armor class in general, and you get the benefits of a robe, which are often very good for spell users. There aren't that many light armors that are very good for this character, especially not until Act 3. So, in general, the light armor proficiency won't come up that often. Bladesong, of course, gives us an additional bonus, so we get 10 feet of movement speed and +2 to our armor class. That +2 is equal to our proficiency bonus, so it's going to increase at later levels to up to +4, which is a pretty significant bonus to your armor class. And you get advantage on acrobatics, which is not a super relevant bonus, and a +2 bonus to your con saves. That makes you much better at maintaining concentration on spells, especially if you have multi-classed with a class that gives you con save proficiency, or have advantage on con saves from an item. So getting that means that we'll be able to maintain concentration much more easily, even though we're probably going to have to roll concentration saves more often than other wizards, since we're going to be playing a little further forward. While using Bladesong, we also get access to the Bladesong Climax ability, and despite the funny name, I want everyone to be extremely mature about this in the comments. Bladesong Climax allows you to build up charges during your Bladesong. You get, by casting spells, you get additional charges of damage, and by attacking with your weapon, you get additional charges of healing. Then you can use a bonus action and 10 feet of your movement speed to jump, so it's basically like a normal jump, and release this Bladesong Climax in a giant explosion of AoE damage to enemies and AoE healing to allies. So the important thing is that if you want the healthiest possible climax, you have to thrust with your blade as frequently as possible, and if you want the most explosive possible climax, you have to release your spells as frequently as possible. That should be an easy way to remember it. Again, stay mature in the comment. Although this does end your Bladesong when you use it, because you're, all spent, you will do a pretty sizable amount of damage. Bladesong damage charges, especially in the early game, are pretty easy to stack up quickly. By casting spells, this will increase the charge, and then in any combat that goes for multiple turns, this can usually be like 3d6 or 4d6 of damage. You can get multiple charges if you have additional actions from haste or a potion of speed or action surge or something like that. And also, spells that you cast off turn, so reactions like the shield spell or counter spell, will also build up damage charges. It's usually more important to build up damage charges because damage is typically more valuable than healing, but remember that you're a fairly low hit point character and you're playing in melee, so having the emergency healing can be very useful if you find yourself suddenly at low health. You can activate your Bladesong Climax and heal back pretty much to full if you've made even just a few weapon attacks in a combat. So while this ability might seem quite situational, it's a great way to end a combat and a great panic button should you find yourself in trouble. At character level 3, we get access to 2 new spells, and we get an extremely important spell for Bladesinging Wizards. That spell is Shadow Blade. Now, one thing that I should mention about this is that, honestly, the most powerful way to build Bladesinging Wizards is probably just as a spellcaster who doesn't make weapon attacks. But obviously you're not playing a Bladesinging Wizard if you don't want to make weapon attacks, so we're going to enable that strategy as much as possible. Shadow Blade gives us a huge amount of sustained damage and a huge amount of burst damage. It's an extremely powerful weapon available at this level. It does work with all of our Bladesinging abilities, and it can stack with Booming Blade and so on. Later in the game, of course, we can also, because this is psychic damage, double it by giving enemies psychic vulnerability, which an item allows us to do passively and for free, so Shadow Blade increases our damage output immensely. Cloud of Daggers gives us an AoE combat damage option, so these are the spells that we're going to learn, though of course your spell selection is going to depend somewhat on what spells you have found from scrolls. A prepared spell list at this level, you can ignore these higher level spells. They are just ones that we happen to have learned with Gale in this save file. But a prepared spell list at this level might look something like Shield and Shadow Blade to give yourself the best option to use melee attacks, Cloud of Daggers as great AoE damage, and Misty Step as an escape option. If you're using a robe, you'll want Mage Armor, otherwise you can take another combat spell like Chromatic Orb, and then we're going to pick up the 2 ritual spells, Longstrider and Enhanced Leap. If you have another party member capable of casting those, you can add Magic Missile back in, obviously a great level 1 combat spell as well that gives you a very reliable combat option. At these early levels, you're just as well off using Booming Blade attacks as casting these low-level combat spells most of the time, though, so you don't need to have level 1 combat spells, which is why our spell list looks a little bit different than it would look for another wizard. At character level 4, we get our first feat, and an additional cantrip. The cantrip that we're going to take here is going to be a little dependent on what scrolls we've found of cantrips. One thing that's worth mentioning is that all of these combat cantrips have scrolls, so you can respec to take the cantrips that don't have scroll equivalents, if you want those. But the most important cantrip to learn here is Bone Chill, because this will enable you to prevent enemy healing and is just an incredibly powerful utility spell, especially as you go on into Act 2, where there's a lot of undead, and it can prevent enemy healing and give undead disadvantage on attack rolls for a full turn. That's a very powerful tool for just a cantrip. Our spell selection, again, is going to be somewhat dependent on what spells we've learned from scrolls, but we're going to be taking Darkness, which is still a powerful tool even if you're not doing Darkness shenanigans. Just enabling your character to retreat and prevent enemy ranged attacks is very useful for a character that does struggle defensively like this one. We've got amazing offense with our spells and our weapon attacks, but we're still a wizard, so we need all the help we can get defensively. Darkness can give us a safe area to retreat to, preventing enemies from ranged attacking us, and Flaming Sphere can distract enemies, so those are some other great options. For our feat at this level, we are going to take Alert. This is an honor mode build, so you should almost always take Alert. It's just such a powerful tool, and as a wizard, we can often lock down enemies with control spells before they go, or deal a whole bunch of damage. So, while we could take an ability score improvement to boost our dexterity or intelligence, I'll talk a little bit more about that choice when we get to our next ASI. Alert is just my recommendation for pretty much every honor mode character at level 4, and this one is no exception. At character level 5, we get access to 3rd level spells, which of course for every spellcaster is a massive power spike. 3rd level spells are where spells really come into their own in terms of power level. We also get an additional use of Bladesong power, which, now that we have 3 charges, lets us be much more liberal with activating this ability. Since this is the main draw to playing this subclass, being able to use it in more encounters increases our effectiveness and our longevity significantly, so these extra uses of Bladesong power are extremely welcome. Our spell selection at this level will again, of course, depend somewhat on what scrolls we've encountered throughout our adventure so far, but there's one spell that can't be taken from a scroll and is absolutely, because no scrolls of it exist in the game, and is absolutely critical for this character to learn, and that spell is, of course, Counterspell. Counterspell has a strong claim on being the best spell in the game regardless, letting you convert your reaction into removing an enemy's entire turn. But for Bladesinging Wizards, it's especially awesome. When you use Counterspell as a reaction, you gain additional Bladesong damage charges, so it charges up the thing that you're trying to do. And a lot of the time, you will be making weapon attacks rather than using your spell slots, especially in combats where you don't need a specific spell to solve that encounter. So you are more likely to have high-level spell slots available than other wizards in order to use counterspell. In other words, spending a level 4 or 5 spell slot on counterspell is a much less painful resource expenditure because your default combat action is so much better than most wizards because you have amazing weapon attacks instead of piddling little cantrips if you're out of spell slots. So counterspell, incredibly synergistic for this character. Other great options include Glyph of Warding, because Glyph of Warding is probably the best non-concentration combat spell. You'll often want to be concentrating on stuff. Haste. This character can haste themselves, and haste, of course, is very good for you. It gives you extra armor class and extra attacks and extra actions, so you can cast spells and use your attacks more frequently. Now, of course, this comes with the risk of losing concentration on haste, but you're one of the best characters to concentrate on haste because you're so good at concentration, and you have high armor class, so you won't get hit quite as often, even if you have haste active. It's very risky, but very powerful. For our prepared spells at this level, we are going to be adding in Counterspell. Of course, we can't take Wall of Fire yet. We're going to be adding in Counterspell 100% of the time, and then we're actually a little starved for spell slots, so we have some decisions to make. I like having one control spell, because of course something like Hypnotic Pattern just wins encounters. And you may want a one-shot damage spell like Lightning Bolt as well. If you're intending to use Haste, then I would recommend keeping, then of course you need to prepare Haste also. Though often Haste can be cast by another party member. My recommendation would be something like this, which gives you Haste for when you want to concentrate on a buff, Hypnotic Pattern for when you want to concentrate on a combat spell, so you don't need Cloud of Daggers as often, and a very scalable spell in the form of Magic Missile, which you can cast with any spell slot that you have available. Most of your level 1 spell slots are going to go to shield anyways, so we don't need that many lower level combat spells, but this gives us a good mix of damage, utility, and control so that we have all of our options available. At character level 6, we get Extra Attack. Now, obviously, Extra Attack is an incredibly powerful class feature, and it's one of the great things about being a Bladesinger Wizard is we get the use of Extra Attack. This gives us a tremendous amount of damage when we're attacking twice in a turn with our Shadow Blade, which also, by the way, got improved because when you, at level 5, because when you cast it with a 3rd or 4th level spell slot, it does 3d8 damage instead of 2d8, so it increases your damage output significantly. We also, our Booming Blade attacks got better when we hit level 5 as well, so those are now dealing more damage also. Each of those things means that our melee damage at level 6 is suddenly extremely respectable. 3d8 damage with attacking twice, and then an additional d8 thunder from the one Booming Blade that we can do is a very solid amount of damage before you even add other sources of additional damage to that from effects like haste or gloves that increase our damage or buffs from allies or Falara Louvre or something like that. So when we don't have a relevant spell to cast, our melee damage output is excellent. This also enables a lot of use of on-hit effects. Things like Arcane Synergy to boost our damage, Arcane Acuity to boost our spellcasting are all made much easier to apply when we can attack multiple times in a turn. So it enables a lot of powerful gear that other wizards don't get access to, and Bladesinging Wizards do. Again, for our spells, we're just going to pick spells that we haven't found scrolls for, but Glyph of Warding, very powerful combat spell. Sleet Storm, a very powerful control spell. Also bear in mind that you can swap out your spell list depending on a couple things. One, if you don't want to spend a Bladesong charge in a given combat, you can just prepare a spell list like a normal wizard and just pretend you're a wizard without melee abilities for that combat. And two, you can prepare these spells for specific encounters that they're good against. So this character, more than most other characters, wants to swap out its spell list frequently. Character level 7, we get 4th level spells, and some of the 4th level spells that are particularly useful to Bladesinging Wizards include Conjure Minor Elementals, which gives us a lot of additional support, and Fire Shield, which can be very useful if you're up in melee. This can give you resistance to fire or cold damage, relevant for some encounters, and let you retaliate to enemy melee attacks. Now, we don't like to get hit, but the extra damage can be pretty useful. I wouldn't recommend preparing this spell for every fight, but it does have its uses if the resistance type that it gives you is relevant. Our prepared spells at this level might look something like the previous spell list, plus Conjure Minor Elemental, which is a great day-long buff for your entire party, and Wall of Fire, which just solves certain encounters on its own. Anytime a group of enemies is coming towards you through a narrow hallway or doorway, or has to approach you, Wall of Fire is very helpful, and you can stand at the edge of the Wall of Fire and opportunity attack enemies coming out of it, like a martial character would, because you're both a martial character and a spellcaster. At character level 8, we have a fairly significant choice to make. We're going to take a feat, and the feat that we're going to take is an ability improvement. But it's actually not clear what stat we want to improve. We have to decide whether we intend to be more a spellcasting character with supplemental melee abilities, or a melee character with supplemental spellcasting abilities. For this guide, I'm going to suggest that you do the latter, melee character with supplemental spellcasting abilities, because it's the most interesting way to use this subclass, and of course it's what the subclass is designed to do. There's a couple different ways that we can accomplish this. We can just raise our dexterity, ignoring intelligence, or we can raise our intelligence and drink a potion of strength, or equip the gloves of dexterity in order to replace our combat abilities with a stat item. Raising our dexterity is a totally fine option. Even though this will prevent our spell save DCs and spell attacks from increasing, because we aren't increasing our casting stat with this feat, this character gets some of the best access in the game to arcane acuity, spell save DC increases from weapon attacks, damage increases from weapon attacks. So we can use our weapon attacks and the items that charge off of those in order to make up for having lower intelligence regardless. So we don't need the stat items, but they are very helpful to enable us to do both melee attacks and still be an expert spellcaster if the melee attacks aren't amazing. So for this build, we're going to increase our dexterity, but there's a lot of different directions you can go here, and if you intend to use an attribute item, you should be increasing your intelligence to make your spellcasting as powerful as possible. For our spell selection at this level, again, we're going to pick up spells that we haven't found, but other good spells include non-concentration combat spells like Ice Storm, and situational spells like Banishment that can be very useful if enemies have low charisma saves. Banishing a powerful boss and then just melee attacking their allies to death is a great way to conserve resources for this character, so Banishment's even better against low charisma save enemies than for the Bladesinging Wizard than it is for other characters. It also lets you build up a bunch of charges before the boss gets back, and then you can explode all over them. At character level 9, with 5th level spells, we also get an additional use of Bladesong power, which now gives us 4 encounters per day where we can activate it, so we probably won't have that many encounters where we aren't able to use this, which is great. Obviously, this is the class's core ability, so using it as often as possible is excellent. And we get access to 5th level spells. The most important of these is probably Conjure Elemental. This character can do this even without having high intelligence. Conjure Elemental doesn't care about your intelligence stat at all, so it will give you a big pile of bonus hit points. Notice that our hit points are quite low at this point, though we can fix that a little bit through gear. But Conjure Elemental gives us something that can stand in between us and enemies and absorb attacks to make it a little less dangerous to play this relatively squishy character as a frontline fighter. We also can pick up Hold Monster, which is very useful for a lot of boss fights, and of course will let us do critical damage with our melee attacks, which is going to vastly multiply our damage output. Since we get 5th level spell slots, our Shadow Blade also increases to 4d8 damage, so the damage of Shadow Blade, if we're using that as our weapon, is again increased at level 9. For prepared spells at this level, we can just add in these 2 new level 5 spells, or go back to pick up one of these controller utility spells from earlier levels, but this is still a very solid spell list that will be very useful no matter what the encounter is. At character level 10, one of the concerns that we've had is that we are relatively squishy, of course, for a frontline combatant, but Bladesinging Wizard at level 10 gets a great answer to that. Whenever we take damage during Bladesong, which we can now have up pretty much all the time, we can spend a spell slot to subtract 5 damage per spell slot. This can be up to 30 damage with a level 6 spell slot, up to 30 damage reduction with a level 6 spell slot. Now, obviously, that's not our favorite way to spend a level 6 spell slot, but this is an extremely powerful ability for keeping yourself alive. In combination with the shield spell and your bonus armor class, which has also gone up to +4 at this level, so the armor class for this character is actually fairly decent now, especially given the amount of gear that we'll have access to that can increase our AC. Song of Defense actually makes us quite resilient, even given our low hit points. If you use an item that increases your hit points, then that obviously gets even better, and since we are a wizard, we have the ability to use Arcane Recovery to get our spell slots back. We can use potions like Arcane Cultivation potions or resting potions in order to recover our spell slots as well. So Song of Defense we can afford to be fairly liberal with because our spell slots are less important than they are for a normal wizard, and we have a lot of them, and it can keep us alive, which obviously is the most important thing for a relatively squishy but high damage character. We also get a cantrip, so of course we're going to take True Strike to annoy people in the YouTube comments, and 2 new spells, and these will be very dependent on what scrolls you have found up to this point. Obviously, whatever spell, in order to sort of play Pokemon, you're just going to grab whatever spells you haven't managed to find scrolls for. Finally, at character level 11, we get 6th level spells, and of course these 6th level spells give us a ton of amazing options. Our best 6th level spell actually though is not on this list, and it's the level 6 version of Conjure Elemental, because that is just a day-long buff that makes our whole party vastly stronger. But there's a couple more 6th level spells that are truly excellent for this character. Globe of Invulnerability is very, very important for every party to have access to, so of course we're going to grab that. This is just a game-winning spell in the late game. A lot of late game bosses are just damage races, and Globe of Invulnerability auto-wins those by making you immune to damage. And then all of these other 6th level spells have a lot of value as well, but I'm going to recommend taking a spell that was newly buffed and is now one of my very favorite spells, Wall of Ice. Wall of Ice has been fixed, so it does 10d6 cold damage when you cast it, and creates an ice surface, so enemies fall prone when you cast Wall of Ice. And then if the wall breaks, it leaves behind a cloud that deals 10d6 cold damage as well. This cloud used to be bugged and only do 5d6 damage, but now does the full 10d6. And it does this damage both when the enemy enters the cloud and at the start of their turn. You can kind of see where this is going. If you can cast Wall of Ice and then break it immediately, which happens when you just cancel concentration on it, an enemy takes before their turn 10d6 initial damage, 10d6 cloud damage, and then 10d6 cloud damage again for a total of 30d6 damage. And then you can double that 30d6 damage with the wet condition for an average of, I don't know, approximately 8 billion damage. Doing the math would be too difficult because that number is too large for my tiny brain to comprehend. But this will pretty much one-shot entire encounters all by itself now that the amount of damage has been increased. You can also just use it as an actual wall if you don't want to just one-shot everything, but the cast and then immediately cancel strategy is so powerful with Wall of Ice that I think that this is now just the best burst damage spell in the game. And finally, at level 12, we get our last feat, and we're going to simply increase our dexterity so that we can hit our weapon attacks more often, or if we are using the Gloves of Dexterity or a Strength Elixir, we're going to max out our intelligence to hit 20 intelligence. I will say that the Strength Elixir version of this build is more powerful, but we're just demoing that you don't have to use it because not everyone wants to use an elixir every day. For our spell selection at this level, again, go back and grab anything that you don't have yet. And then for our prepared spell list, we're going to be picking up our high-level spells, our burst damage spells from these higher levels, and then grabbing a control or utility spell from lower levels, or something like Lightning Bolt that can be very useful. Also, depending on our item selection, Hold Person can be extremely powerful as well, because it's an enchantment spell, so it works with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, which of course this character uses extraordinarily well. Alright, my friends, that is the Bladesinging Wizard. And I hope you've enjoyed the leveling process, but of course we can make this character much more powerful with items, so let's talk about those. 4 items for this character, we have access to some of the most powerful item combinations in the entire game. So firstly, of course, for our weapon, we are either going to be using a Shadow Blade, which we would cast with a level 5 spell slot in order to have an extremely powerful weapon that lasts all day, does a ton of extra damage. No, it didn't cast with the level 5 spell slot. There we go. That does 48 damage plus our dexterity modifier because it's still a finesse weapon, and of course can be doubled if we're using the Shadow Blade with the Resonant Stone. The Resonant Stone gives everything nearby, so it doesn't even have to be equipped in an item slot, just nearby allies and enemies get this effect, the Steeped Bliss condition. That gives them advantage on physical checks, disadvantage on mental saves, which is kind of punishing for this character, but can be relatively easily avoided. And you do have good saves as a wizard. But most importantly, makes everything vulnerable to psychic damage. The Shadow Blade does psychic damage, so doubling that psychic damage is obviously an incredible amount of damage with a weapon attack. We also have a weapon that's kind of made for us, that I actually like even more than the Shadow Blade once we get access to it, and that is, of course, the Duelist's Prerogative. This weapon requires us to have an empty offhand and a rapier in our main hand, and in order to use Bladesinging, we need an empty offhand and a sword in our main hand. So the Duelist's Prerogative is basically made for this character, and gives us a tremendous amount of bonuses. We increase our critical hit chance, it's a +3 weapon, so while it does less damage overall than the Shadow Blade, it's much more reliable to actually attack, and we get an additional reaction every single turn. An extra reaction, I can't overstate just how absurdly powerful this is. It lets us counterspell multiple things. It lets us use the shield spell multiple times. If we took the Sentinel feat, which is definitely an option that we can use with this character as well, it lets us use Sentinel opportunity attacks or just normal opportunity attacks even without it multiple times. And we can spend that reaction in the worst case scenario on dealing just additional necrotic damage on each one of our attacks. It also gives us a couple of additional abilities here. Dueler's Enthusiasm, which lets us make an extra attack as a bonus action every turn. So basically we can turn our bonus action into a third attack, and challenge to duel, which generally I don't recommend casting, but still does have some useful application sometimes. So once we get at where it gives enemies disadvantage on attacks on everyone except you. Now, usually you don't want enemies to attack your Bladesinging Wizard. You want to run away instead of that. But it's still a marginally useful ability in some circumstances. Mostly, though, the extra reaction that you get from the Duelist's Prerogative is so good for this character that you'll often want to swap from the Shadow Blade to this weapon. Or you can use a mixture of the two, depending on whether you want a more defensive or more offensive setup. Other great weapon options include, of course, Markaheshkir. It's not a sword, so you can't use Bladesinging with it, but you can use it and then swap weapons to just get an extra cast of Chain Lightning every short rest, which is incredibly powerful. And of course, ways to refresh our spell slots with Arcane Battery are incredibly important for this character because we often cast day-long buff spells and then still want our spell slots in combat. Another weapon that actually forgoes Bladesong but still uses this character's extra attack is Char's Spear of Evening. I mention this not because it's very thematic, so I don't recommend this because you could just play a Hexblade instead if you wanted to use this ability, but it is still a very powerful way to build the character with darkness. Other ways to see through darkness are also very good, like the Eversight Ring, and those, of course, can be used with sword. This character also gets access to one of the most powerful mechanics in Baldur's Gate 3, probably the single most broken mechanic in Baldur's Gate 3, in the form of Arcane Acuity. We can use either the Helmet of Arcane Acuity or the newly fixed Gloves of Battle Mage's Power, which now actually work, to generate Arcane Acuity every time we attack. This gives us an additional a bonus to the difficulty class of our spells, so we can be a powerful spellcaster even with the relatively low intelligence of 16 as long as we're making weapon attacks. The Gloves of Battle Mage's Power work off of any time we hit with a spell that uses a weapon, so Booming Blade, but also work with every single attack of Shadow Blade. So if we're a Shadow Blade build, we'll want the gloves. If we're a Duelist's Prerogative build, we'll want the helmet. In combination with these, of course, the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel lets you use your spells as a bonus action, so we can then make weapon attacks and then cast an enchantment or illusion spell, like Hold Person, Hold Monster, or Hypnotic Pattern as a bonus action, with an unresistably high save DC because of Arcane Acuity. So this character, yet again, gets one of the most powerful combos in the game in that form. For our armor, we're probably just going to want to go with the Robe of the Weave in the late game because it gives us a decent amount of armor class. It's higher armor class than most light armor options anyways, and it gives us a bonus to our spell save DC. The one light armor that is kind of nice for this character is actually the Armor of the Spore Keeper. Although we can't use the Spore Druid unique abilities, we do get the +1 bonus to spell save DC, and we deal additional necrotic damage with every attack, which does work with the Duelist prerogative. So that one necrotic damage doesn't seem like much, but adds up over the course of many, many attacks that you're making during the game. Other increases to our spell save DC are very, very useful, so items like the Fistbreaker Helm can be very useful. And, of course, stat items, like I talked about, we can use either the Gloves of Dexterity, or Elixirs of Hill Giant Strength, or the Warped Headband of Intellect, to allow us to take less dexterity or less intelligence, and then max out our spellcasting modifiers as well. The Elixir is probably the best of these because it just lets you use exactly this setup, but with 20 intelligence and 20 strength, and then you make attacks and cast spells at the maximum possible efficiency. Some other good options for gloves, in addition to the Battle Mage's Power Gloves, include the Bracers of Defense. Obviously, we're not going to be using a shield, and we're only in light armor. We are probably going to be in a robe for a lot of the game, so these just give us +2 armor class. And the Helldust Gloves, which give us both attack bonuses to our attacks, bonuses to our spell save DCs, and extra damage on every attack, as well as the Rays of Fire spell, which is very good. The Ring of Arcane Synergy works with Booming Blade to give us Arcane Synergy, so it makes our attacks better by our intelligence modifier. This is especially good if we are using elixirs to have, or the Gloves of Dexterity in order to have higher intelligence, because it's just going to add an additional bonus of +5 to every single weapon attack that we make. So obviously very, very powerful there. Other than that, we're just looking for ways to increase our armor class. Defensive options are very good on this character, so an item like the Evasive Shoes is very, very nice for this character. Since we're going to be concentrating on spells a lot and don't want to lose concentration, and we're quite squishy, we do need to make sure that we have relatively high AC. With 20 base AC here, and then, of course, we can cast Mage Armor in order to increase our armor class even further. So this gives us 23 base AC with the Bracers of Defense, the Robe of the Weave, and the Evasive Shoes. That's a pretty solid amount of armor class. It can go up to 28 with the Shield spell, and then when we activate Blade Song, it increases our armor class by 4 more for the duration of the fight. So now we suddenly have 27 armor class if we've boosted our armor class, and can increase it even further with the shield spell. So it makes this character, which was kind of squishy all game, suddenly an AC monster in the late game, and relatively difficult to actually do damage to. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the Bladesinging Wizard, and I hope that it helps you plan out your honor mode runs with spell and blade working in harmony together. And I hope that you achieve the largest Blade Song climax that you are capable of. As always, of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit the like button. Helps me out with the algorithm, so I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides, especially with the new patch 8 subclasses and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.